By the early 1990s, American V8s were finally escaping the dark days of emissions strangulation. While the LS1 gets all the glory today, there's one engine that quietly saved performance and still doesn't get nearly enough credit. The 1992 Chevy LT1, with its revolutionary reverse flow cooling and 300 horsepower. Hey everyone, before we dive deep into this engine story, here's a question for you. After nearly 2 decades of choked power and smog-era misery, do you think the 1992 LT1 was the true turning point that rescued American V8 performance? Or was it simply an overlooked stepping stone on the way to the LS era? Drop your honest take in the comments right now. Underrated legend, or just a bridge to something bigger? I'd love to hear what you think. By the early 1990s, American V8 engines were finally starting to emerge from the long shadow of the emissions control era. While most conversations today revolve around the later LS1, one power plant still doesn't get nearly the credit it deserves: the 1992 LT1. Rated at 300 horsepower, equipped with groundbreaking reverse flow cooling, and marking the first time a standard Corvette cracked the 300 horsepower barrier since the muscle car days ended. This engine quietly proved that GM still knew exactly how to build serious performance. To fully understand why the LT1 mattered so much, you first have to remember just how bleak things had become. The 1970 Clean Air Act slammed into Detroit like a hammer. The EPA demanded a staggering 90% reduction in hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, and nitrogen oxides by the 1975 model year. The technology needed to hit those targets while keeping real power simply didn't exist yet. So the manufacturers did the only thing they could: they choked their engines. Compression ratios dropped sharply, ignition timing was pulled back, carburetors were leaned out. Exhaust gas recirculation systems showed up everywhere. And those early catalytic converters, especially GM's pellet-style units from the mid-1970s, created crushing back pressure that killed whatever horsepower remained. The numbers paint a brutal picture. In 1970, you could order a Corvette LT1 pumping out 370 horsepower from a 350 cubic inch V8. Just 5 years later, the 1975 L48 Corvette was left with a dismal 165 horsepower from the exact same displacement, a devastating 55% loss. That pathetic output was actually lower than what the very first 1953 Corvette produced with its inline-six. The entire 1980s felt like one long exercise in damage control. The 1982 Crossfire injection was a complete failure that nobody wanted. Twin-port injection arrived in 1984 and was genuinely decent for its time. The 1985 IROC Z Camaro with TPI felt like a revelation, finally offering both respectable performance and decent fuel economy. By 1991, the L98 in the Corvette had climbed back to 245 horsepower, better than the dark days, but still far below historical standards. Meanwhile, Ford's 5.0-liter Mustangs were breathing down GM's neck. Detroit desperately needed a performance renaissance, and it needed one badly. What if the secret to bringing big power back wasn't just bigger cams or wilder heads, but something as simple as rethinking how coolant flows through the engine? That's exactly what made the LT1 special. In 1992, Chevrolet dropped the LT1 into the C4 Corvette and immediately changed the game. 300 horsepower at 5,000 revolutions per minute and 330 lb-ft of torque at 4,000 revolutions per minute. That was a massive 55 horsepower jump over the previous year's L98, a full 20% increase in power. For the first time since 1974, a base Corvette engine officially crossed the 300 horsepower mark again. But the LT1 wasn't impressive just because of the headline numbers. It was impressive because of how smartly GM engineered around 2 decades of emissions misery. They focused on better breathing, higher compression, and one revolutionary feature that almost nobody expected: reverse flow cooling. Here's how a normal engine cools itself. Coolant first enters the block, circulates around the cylinders, then moves up into the heads before heading back to the radiator. It's simple and proven, but far from ideal. The heads are by far the hottest part of the engine. That's where combustion explodes and exhaust gases scream through. By the time coolant reaches the heads in a traditional setup, it's already warm from the block, so the heads run hotter than necessary. The LT1 flipped the entire system. Coolant now entered the heads first, getting the coldest liquid exactly where heat was most concentrated, then flowed down into the block. This single change allowed GM to safely run a 10.5-to-1 compression ratio without detonation problems. Higher compression delivered more power and better thermal efficiency. On top of that, the cylinder bores stayed slightly warmer and more consistent, which reduced piston ring friction. Less friction meant more usable power reaching the wheels. Reverse flow cooling wasn't originally a GM idea. The concept came from independent engineer John Evans, who worked with GM and claimed he developed both the reverse flow system and the critical steam vents that made it reliable. GM insisted they created it independently. The dispute turned into a nearly decade-long legal battle. In 2003, a GM engineer even admitted under oath to fabricating evidence, specifically faking a 1988 sketch meant to prove GM invented it first, whoever truly originated it. Reverse flow cooling became an industry standard and was the key that unlocked the LT1's performance. The clever engineering didn't stop there. The water pump was gear-driven directly off the camshaft instead of using a belt. This removed side loads on the bearings and greatly improved reliability. GM was aiming for a minimum 100,000-mile lifespan. Even better, if the serpentine belt ever snapped, the water pump would keep running. So you wouldn't overheat on the side of the road, a real safety win. The intake manifold was completely dry, no coolant passages running through it at all. Coolant crossover happened inside the water pump housing instead. That eliminated one of the biggest leak points on older small blocks, where a failing intake gasket could dump coolant straight onto the cam and lifters. The LT1 also featured smart steam vents at the back of the heads that routed a small amount of coolant through the throttle body for better cold weather performance. On top of all that, the LT1 used sequential port fuel injection, aluminum heads on Corvettes and F-bodies that flowed significantly better than the old L98 heads, and shorter intake runners that helped the engine pull strongly all the way to 700 revolutions per minute instead of falling flat at 500 revolutions per minute like its predecessor. The only real weak point was the OptiSpark distributor, an optical ignition system mounted at the front of the engine. Great idea in theory, but early versions suffered from moisture issues, corrosion, and vulnerability to water pump leaks. It became the LT1's most criticized feature, though the aftermarket eventually solved most of those problems. Let's talk real-world results. How quick was this engine in the metal? The 1992 Corvette with the automatic transmission ripped to 60 miles per hour in roughly 5.4 seconds. A solid 0.6-second improvement over the 1991 L98 model. The quarter mile came in around 13.7 seconds at 102 miles per hour for the auto, while manual cars dipped into the low 13s. Top speed sat right around 163 miles per hour. Not supercar territory by today's standards. But in 1992, that was seriously quick for a front-engine, rear-wheel drive American sports car. When the LT1 jumped into the 1993 Camaro Z28 and Pontiac Firebird Trans Am, it made 275 horsepower thanks to more restrictive exhaust and milder tuning. Still more than enough to leave the Ford 5.0 Mustang GT in the rearview mirror. These 4th-gen F-bodies instantly became performance bargains, fast, great handling, and relatively affordable. Many enthusiasts still consider the 93 to 97 Camaros and Firebirds some of the best bang-for-buck muscle cars ever built. Then in 1994, GM spread the LT1 love to full-size cars. The Chevy Caprice, Impala SS, Buick Roadmaster, and Cadillac Fleetwood all received LT1 power, though these versions used iron heads instead of aluminum and were rated at 260 horsepower. The Impala SS especially became a cult hero. A big, comfortable, family-sized sedan that could genuinely embarrass sports cars at stoplights. There's something magical about a 4,000-pound yacht with a healthy V8. It proved you didn't need a two-seater to have serious performance. By 1996, Chevrolet took everything they learned and created the hotter LT4 for the final C for Corvettes. Bigger valves, roller rockers, a more aggressive camshaft, revised heads, and refined sequential fuel injection pushed output to 330 horsepower and 340 lb-ft of torque. This was the peak evolution of the LT1 platform, the ultimate version before the clean-sheet LS1 arrived. Now put those numbers in perspective. 1975 L48 Corvette, 165 horsepower. 1991 L98 Corvette, 245 horsepower. 1992 LT1 Corvette, 300 horsepower. 1996 LT4 Corvette, 330 horsepower. In just over 2 decades, GM nearly doubled the power from the absolute low point of the smog era while meeting much stricter emissions rules and delivering better fuel economy. The LT1's torque curve was especially impressive. 90% of peak torque was available from just over 1,000 RPM all the way to nearly 6,000 RPM. That broad, usable power band meant you rarely had to hunt for the right gear. Just step on the throttle and the engine simply pulled. Compared to the old smog-era engines with their low compression, retarded timing, lean mixtures, and restrictive exhaust, the LT1 felt like it came from another planet. It proved that smart engineering could deliver power, efficiency, and clean emissions at the same time. So if the LT1 was this good, why does almost everyone ignore it today? Why does the LS1 get all the spotlight and glory? The LS1 arrived in 1997 with the all-new C5 Corvette, an all-aluminum block and heads, starting at 345 horsepower, later 350, lighter, stronger, and far more advanced. It was a true clean-sheet design with an entirely new architecture. The LS1 didn't just improve on the past, it created the foundation for the legendary LS engine family that still dominates the performance world today. The LT1 gets overshadowed because it was the ultimate transitional engine. It kept the classic small block architecture and simply refined it to the absolute limit. Cast iron block in most versions, traditional, though optical, distributor, and it still carried some old-school DNA. It was the last chapter of the original small block story, not the first page of the modern era. Then there's that infamous OptiSpark. Its reliability issues in the early years gave the entire LT1 family a bad reputation it never fully shook off. Even though the aftermarket fixed most of those problems years ago, perception is everything. The LS1's coil near plug ignition was simply more reliable from day one and easier to live with. The LS1 also enjoyed much stronger aftermarket support right from the start, more parts, more tuning potential, lighter weight for engine swaps, and it became the default choice for restomods and project cars. The LT1 quietly got left behind in the conversation. But here's what most people forget. The LT1 came first and proved the entire concept was possible. After almost 20 years of emissions strangulation, it showed GM could once again build a genuinely strong, exciting V8. It restored credibility to the Corvette, the Camaro, and the Firebird. Without the LT1's success, the LS1 might never have happened, or at least not with the same confidence. The LT1 served as the perfect bridge. It connected the classic small block era to the modern LS world. It introduced reverse flow cooling that became the industry standard. It proved sequential fuel injection could deliver both serious power and good fuel economy. It showed you didn't need massive displacement or exotic materials to make strong, usable horsepower. Every lesson learned from the LT1, the importance of cooling for high compression, the value of a gear-driven water pump, the need for excellent cylinder head flow, was carried forward into the LS1 and every GM small block that followed. The LT1 powered some truly memorable cars that regular people could actually buy and enjoy. The final years of the C4 Corvette, from 1992 to 1996. The fourth-generation Camaros and Firebirds from 1993 to 1997, the surprisingly quick Impala SS, and even some police cruisers. These weren't exotic supercars. They were real-world performance machines that delivered excitement without breaking the bank. And yes, you can still build serious power with an LT1 today. The aftermarket has long since solved the OptiSpark headaches with better ignition solutions. Stronger internals, forced induction, nitrous. People are regularly pushing built LT1s to 500, 600, and even 800 plus horsepower. The cast iron block in most versions is actually very strong for high-power applications, often tougher than many early aluminum blocks. The 1992 to 1997 LT1 deserves far more respect than it usually gets. Sure, the LS1 is better in almost every measurable way: more power, lighter weight, more reliable ignition, and a stronger foundation for the future. Nobody is debating that. But the LT1 was the engine that brought performance back after the long, dark smog-era nightmare. It showed the path forward. It proved that American V8s still had a bright future. 300 horsepower might sound modest in 2026 when factory trucks are making 700 horsepower, but in 1992, it was a bold statement. It told the world that GM was back in the performance game for real. Every LS engine, every modern small block, and every high-performance V8 GM has built since then owes something important to the LT1. So the next time you see a clean C4 Corvette, a 4th-gen Camaro Z28, or an Impala SS rolling down the road, take a moment to appreciate what's under the hood. It's not just an engine, it's a piece of history. The bridge between the old-school small block era and the modern performance revolution. The engine that quietly started GM's modern V8 comeback. That's the story of the LT1, the forgotten hero that paved the way for everything that came after.